Welcome, committee members. Welcome, witnesses, to this 42nd meeting of the Special Committee on Electoral Reform. We have, we're sorry for the delay. To the witnesses, we're sorry for the delay. We had about an hour of voting in the House. So we have with us...
Mr. Collins.
Yes.
Very briefly, I just wanted and apologize for the witnesses. We'll get right to you. You've been waiting. I just want to give committee members notice of a motion that we'll put on tonight, knowing that we need 48 hours, I believe. Is that? I think it's 48 hours.
I think so. If it pertains to the committee.
Yes, it's a very straightforward motion. I think it should likely be received well by all. And we have copies in French and English for people who would like to receive it afterwards. That the committee invite the Minister of Democratic Institutions to table a summary of her public consultations with the committee. We've received the consultation reports from many MPs who have conducted them. This is one, and it may just likely be an oversight at the Minister's office. We just haven't seen the Ministers, and we know she's been on the road a great deal. So this is simply an invitation for her to present to the committee so the committee can incorporate what the Minister has also heard as well.
Okay. So we'll discuss this at a later date? Yeah.
Yes, okay. As committee protocol requires, unless we have unanimous consent, of course. But no. Seeing none.
You don't need 48 hours if it's a motion that pertains to committee business. So,
okay.
So do you want to...
my only caution is taking away time. I don't know if this requires discussion. That's all I wanted to say about it. I don't suspect it's very straightforward.
Okay, well, why don't we deal with it after the witnesses have... Yeah, okay. Okay, so we have with us, appearing as an individual, Mr. Byron Weber Becker. Thank you for being here, Mr. Becker. And we have from the Electoral Reform Society of the United Kingdom, the Honourable Darren Hughes, Deputy Chief Executive, and Katie, is it Ghosh? Ghosh? Ghosh. Okay. Chief Executive. And from Dominion Voting Systems, we have John Poulos, President and Chief Executive Officer, and John McKinstry, the Account Executive. So the way we work is Mr. Weber Becker will have 10 minutes. Mr. Hughes and Ms. Ghosh will have 10 minutes to split, and Dominion Voting Systems, Mr. Poulos, Mr. McKinstry will split 10 minutes. Then we'll have a round of questions, which we can, where each member gets to ask questions. The time limit for each member of Parliament in their questioning of witnesses will be 7 minutes tonight. But we just have one round of 7-minute questions. So without further ado, we'll start with Mr. Weber Becker, please.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for your time and energy that you are investing in the health of our democracy. You are investigating important issues related to how Canadians express their will as we elect our leaders. I very much appreciate the work that you are doing. I also appreciate this opportunity to address you regarding my own work. I teach computer science at the University of Waterloo, where I've been a faculty member for 25 years. I have also been interested in electoral reform for the last decade. Over the summer and into the fall, I combined my expertise in computer science with my interest in electoral reform to model many of the systems that have been proposed for Canada. Model is a critical word to understand in this context. This is the definition that I would like to use: the application of electoral system rules to data, producing results that assist in understanding the behavior of the system. I want to emphasize the last phrase. I'm trying to understand the overall behavior of electoral systems. My goal is not to predict who wins and who loses under a different system. That goal has many difficulties, including voters changing how they vote when the system changes. Instead, I'm attempting to use past elections to see if the system is well behaved. If it has been well behaved in many such elections, we can expect it to be well behaved in future elections, even if voters change how they vote. What does it mean for a system to be well behaved? I think this committee's own mandate provides a helpful definition that I'm sure you'll recognize. A well-behaved system reduces distortion and strengthens the link between voter intention and the election of representatives. Distortion is introduced when representation in government is significantly different from the level of popular support expressed in the election. A well-behaved system should not be arbitrary or erratic. First past the post, for example, will award a party earning 40% of the vote anywhere from 0 to 338 seats in the House of Commons. With a well-behaved electoral system, a small change in the votes cast should result in only a small change in the MPs elected. Another way to say that is that in a well-behaved system, the number of MPs awarded is proportional to the number of votes earned. With that preamble, let's dig into the meat of my results. Graphs like this are central to my methodology for understanding whether a system is well behaved. It shows the proportionality of an electoral system across 7 sets of data. This graph is for first past the post and shows what a misbehaving system looks like. In contrast, here's the graph of the rural-urban system. It is well behaved. Notice how each pair of colored lines track each other closely. Let's take a few moments to understand these graphs. The center, at 0%, represents the data from an actual election. In this case, first past the post, 2015. The heavy points are the percentage of the popular vote for a particular party. The Liberals earned almost 40% of the votes, the Conservatives 32%, and so on for the other parties. The lighter points reflect how the parties were rewarded with MPs in the House. The Liberals' 39% vote share turned into 54% of the MPs at the expense of the other parties, who received fewer MPs than they deserved. In 2015, first past the post was a misbehaving electoral system. But this is old news. We knew this on election night. What value have I added? Remember that we want to see how each electoral system behaves in many different but realistic elections, not just in 2015. We can simulate a different election by taking the 2015 results and shifting 10% of each Conservative candidate's vote to the local Liberal candidate. That might reflect an election in which late-breaking good news for the Liberals swings voters to their camp. Applying the first-past-the-post voting rules to that set of data gives the Liberals 64% of the MPs with only 43% of the vote. If we swing 30% of the Conservative votes to the Liberals, they get 81% of the seats, but still don't have a majority of the votes. Meanwhile, the effect on the Conservatives is devastating. 7% of the seats, in spite of earning 22% of the votes. Of course, we can also simulate the movement of Liberal voters to the Conservatives. That is shown in the left side of the graph. Other graphs can simulate votes shifting between other combinations of parties. First-past-the-post misbehavior plays out in previous elections as well. These 4 graphs represent 4 real elections and 24 simulated elections. First-past-the-post did not give a proportional result in any of them. Let's move on to take a brief look at some of the other electoral systems. The rural-urban proportional system is very well behaved. Here's the graph applying those rules to the 2015 election data and simulated related elections where votes swing between Conservatives and Liberals. Recall that the heavy lines represent the popular vote, while the lighter lines indicate the number of MPs. The important thing to note is how the 2 lines track each other very closely. Here are the graphs based on earlier elections. In each case, the system is well behaved. I like the rural-urban proportional system as proposed by Fair Vote Canada because it addresses our huge disparity in riding sizes. It keeps our already huge ridings at about the same size by electing a single MP in those ridings. It gains proportionality by using multi-member ridings where higher population densities make that feasible. Finally, a small layer of top-up seats, like are used in MMP, offsets the disproportionality of the single-member seats. That top-up layer is important. Rural-urban proportional is inspired by Kingsley's proposal, but it is not the same. Kingsley's proposal leaves off the top-up layer. When we model that, the result is surprisingly good, but not as good as rural-urban. I've also modeled STV, single transferable vote, where with both small ridings averaging 4.1 MPs, as well as larger ridings averaging nearly 11 MPs. Both are well behaved, but predictably the system with the larger ridings does better. Modeling mixed member proportional, or MMP, with two sizes of top-up regions also shows that it is also well behaved. Alternative vote has the distinction of being the only system I modeled that misbehaved more than first past the post. Using data from 4 real elections and 72 simulated elections, alternative vote did not produce a single proportional result. Another alternative that might seem attractive is to keep exactly the same riding boundaries that we have now, but enlarge the House with 10% more MPs, making them top-up seats similar to MMP. We might call this MMP Light if we elected MPs in the local ridings using first past the post, or we could call it AV Plus if we elected MPs using the alternative vote. While both of these systems would be a step towards proportionality, my modeling shows that it would be a very small step, even with the best case scenario of calculating top-up seats over each province, rather than smaller regions as is common with MMP. A 10% top-up simply is not enough to overcome the disproportionalities of all those single-member ridings. But if we use exactly the same constraints with the rural-urban system, that is, 32 extra MPs assigned to top-up seats and calculated at the provincial level, we get a well-behaved system. Thank you for your attention thus far. I've gone over some very detailed and technical material. You may feel at this point like my brother, who said, "That makes my head hurt." Nevertheless, I believe it is important information for your decisions. Let me summarize. First past the post frequently misbehaves. Secondly, alternative vote is worse than first past the post. Thirdly, STV, MMP, and rural-urban are all well behaved across many different simulations. And lastly, MMP Light, half-hearted attempts like MMP Light and AV Plus are only slightly better than what we have now. Rural-urban, under exactly the same constraints, is excellent. The program that I've written and the input data is available for anyone to download and run or modify. The results I've shown here are readily available on the web at electionmodeling.ca. Thank you again for your attention and for the incredible service that you are performing for Canada. I look forward to your questions on my comments here, as well as my earlier submission to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Weber-Becker. Our heads may hurt, but it's a small price to pay for the insights that your models have brought to our discussion. We'll go now to Mr. Hughes and Ms. Gauche.
Great, thank you, and good evening. Merci de nous avoir invités.
Thank you for having invited us to speak to the committee about our position and our experiences on election systems in the United Kingdom. My colleague Mr. Hughes and I thank you for welcoming us. Our organization is a non-governmental one which works to improve the democratic system in the UK. We feel that every voice should be heard, every vote valued, and votes fairly translated into parliamentary seats. I'll address the UK experience of proportional voting. Then my colleague, Mr. Hughes, will speak to the New Zealand experience. New Zealand changed its system in 1996. And finally, I'll share reflections on the UK's recent experience of referendums.
Warm welcome. The Electoral Reform Society campaigns for a better democracy in the UK. We believe that every voice should be heard, every vote valued, and votes fairly translated into parliamentary seats. I'll address the UK experience of proportional voting, and I'm loving the well-behaved idea, which isn't one I'd come across before. Then my colleague Darren will speak to the New Zealand experience, and finally I'll share reflections on the UK's recent experience of referendums. First past the post, as you may know, is used to elect all members of Parliament and in England and Wales only municipal representatives. All our other institutions and elected offices use other systems. The ERS's preferred system is a proportional system with a constituency link that allows voters to vote preferentially for candidates from parties or independents. This system, the single transferable vote form of PR, is used in Scottish municipal elections as well as in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, and it's a candidate-centred system that puts maximum choice in the hands of the voter rather than the party. Why do we like it? Because candidates reach out to far more voters and they visit neighbourhoods that they never bothered with under first past the post. They literally go to parts of the community that would otherwise go untouched. They have a different kind of a conversation, often more positive. After all, they're saying, you might not want to give me your first preference. How about giving me your second or your third preference? It's a different kind of conversation. It's a more positive conversation. There's more competition. Uncontested seats are a thing of the past at the Scottish municipal level. There are no no-go areas. Competing everywhere is worthwhile. And people are far more likely to have a representative that they voted for and a choice of representative to visit. And there's some evidence of some specialisation when it comes to casework. After all, when there's a team of MPs or representatives voting locally, you can begin to have some sharing of the casework load. Translated to federal level, that approach sees a team of local MPs from a range of parties, very much like in Ireland, where it's used for the lower house, and you have 3 to 5 local MPs. And interestingly, Ireland has those multi-member constituencies elected by STV, an extremely local focus by candidates, which is interesting that that's something that they have under a proportional constituency system. Turning to MMP, that we also have some experience of, we call it AMS, the additional member system, but it's AMP, as MMP. That's the system used in Scotland and Wales for the parliaments, and as you all know, it's a system where people can vote for the constituency, representative and a party list. What happens? It produces broadly proportional parliaments where people are seeing seats reflect votes. Voters retain a clearly identifiable local representative. It has produced both power-sharing governments and majority governments. And crucially, it's also enabled parties to put forward a balanced and diverse group of representatives. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Darren.
Thank you, Katie. I just wanted to share some of the New Zealand experience from the New Zealand perspective from experience that I had as both a constituency and a list MP in New Zealand under a proportional system. And I think New Zealand is an interesting case study because to me it's a unique clash of unfairness, some anger amongst the voters, and also a bit of luck that always helps in politics. Basically, the New Zealand context, I think, is very hard to replicate, leading towards proportional representation. There had been 2 general elections in a row where the biggest party in vote share became the opposition rather than the government. There had been a decline in the 2-party system from the voters' perspective, and there were regularly elections where 3rd, 4th parties would receive large shares of the vote. One in particular got 20% of the vote and returned only 2 seats. So that kind of sense of unfairness was really building up quite strongly. And then on the anger side in the 1980s, there was far-reaching economic and social reform that some of you may be familiar with that left virtually no area of life untouched. And that was delivered by parties, both the centre-right and the centre-left, contrary to what their manifesto commitments had been, and with a real sense of a revolution taking place in the country in a policy sense, and with no direct mandate from the public for that. And so that combination of unfairness in results and anger amongst voters about the state of politics, the actions of politicians and the policies that they were following really did lead to that unique scenario, that moment where change was able to be achieved. There was also reported that the Prime Minister misread his notes that said, please don't promise a referendum on proportional representation, and he said out loud, there will be a referendum on proportional representation. So it was hard to row back from that once he had said that. So that's why I say bit of unfairness, a bit of anger amongst voters, and a bit of luck. The result has been for over 20 years strong, stable, respected governments that go the full term, contrary to often some of the perceptions about PR. There have been 7 general elections, and all but a couple of years have resulted in minority governments, parties having to work together in order to get things done. These governments have crossed the ideological spectrum. In fact, there have been more centre-right governments than centre-left, although the centre-left has had a good fair share of time in government as well. And in terms of strong leadership, Helen Clark, the Labour Prime Minister, and John Key, the National Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, are easily 2 of the most successful leaders those parties have had in 40 years, from a policy program, popularity and election-winning record. There's been a tremendous advancement on diversity of the House of Representatives in New Zealand, far many more women members, ethnic minority members, and of course, crucially, better Indigenous representation for Indigenous New Zealanders, Māori people, than first past the post could ever have achieved. And Kiwis, New Zealanders now like it. After 6 attempts, at the 6th general election under proportional representation, there was a further referendum. That wasn't planned at the time, but it's something that happened. And after this experience 6 times of PR, it was chosen again by New Zealanders to stick with PR, which means that political parties have adapted. It hasn't been easy initially, but they've adapted and they've made it work. And there are no serious anti-proportional representation parties today in New Zealand. It has become very much a mainstream part of democracy that's good for voters and that political parties and politicians have been able to make work.
Great. I'm just going to wrap up with a few reflections on referendums, which have been quite a new phenomenon for us in the UK and might be of interest. The electoral reform referendum in 2011 was a classic case of proxy voting. The real issue on the ballot paper became the unpopularity of the junior coalition party, the Liberal Democrats. And in contrast with New Zealand, where voters had an opportunity to consider the pros and the cons of the status quo, first past the post, in the UK we were just plunged into a really negative discussion about the one non-proportional system that was on offer. The voting system was of low interest and voters had no prior knowledge to get to grips with the issues. The campaign was too short. It was a low interest, low information, low turnout, 41% referendum. In contrast, the Scottish referendum campaign, this was looking at the potential independence of Scotland as a country, lasted for 2 years, so it really gave voters the time and space to get to grips with the issues in some detail and to become knowledgeable. The stories of heated debate about technical issues around the currency arrangements at bus stops and in the pub are all true. People had enough time to get really informed and knowledgeable. It was a high information, high interest, high turnout referendum at 86% turnout. And the evidence shows that the political capacity building that took place during that referendum has sustained itself, with more Scots now taking part in formal and informal political activity. Finally, the EU referendum campaign the formal campaign just lasted for 4 months. It was very short. People told us, and this is in our report, it's good to talk, doing referendums differently after the EU vote. We did polling throughout the campaign. They said they didn't feel well informed about the issues. At the start of the campaign in February, only 16% felt well or very well informed. That rose to just a third with a week to go towards polling day. Now, obviously, that's reporting how informed people feel. It's not scientific, but it does give us a good indication that people didn't feel informed. The issue mattered hugely to everybody in the UK, and so the turnout was high. It was 72%, but it was a high interest, low information, high turnout referendum. Done well, referendums can help to achieve high-quality public information and debate in the run-up to polling day. Done badly, a referendum can obliterate any chance of meaningful public and political debate, as the ballot topic is completely overtaken by proxy issues. Reflecting on comparable examples and the particular time constraints of the Canadian process, where there's a real practical deadline around implementation, we cannot see how a good referendum is achievable here. We'll conclude our remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. We'll go now to Mr. Poulos and Mr. McKinstry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is John Poulos, and I'm the President and CEO of Dominion Voting Systems based in Toronto. I have been following this committee with great interest, in particularly the presentations by Mr. Marc Mayran, Mr. Greg Asenza, and Mr. Jean-Pierre Kingsley, all renowned election administrators for whom I have the utmost respect, and I am familiar with the various alternatives that have been proposed to date. I've asked to appear before this committee to provide a first-hand perspective of how technology is currently deployed in elections around the world and how technology may address some of the issues that arise when contemplating different electoral systems. Electoral automation has been my profession for the past 14 years, and such, not only am I aware of the global trends and discussions, I have broad and diverse first-hand experience in deploying tabulation technology for administrators globally. Internationally, we have deployed tabulation technology in the Philippines, representing a voting base of 50 million eligible voters across 82,500 polls, nationwide in Mongolia, which represents perhaps the most severe environmental and physical challenges to voting, more recently across the entire island of Puerto Rico. In the United States, we work with over 1,000 electoral agencies across 35 states, including several statewide deployments. This November, we will be tabulating the votes for nearly just over 1/3 of U.S. voters. In Canada, we provide tabulation technologies to over 100 agencies at the municipal, provincial, and at the pilot, even the federal level. Now, when considering a potential change to the electoral system, including any of the various voting alternatives proposed to this committee, I will first address the need for timely results. As the complexity of the ballot increases, so does the time needed to manually hand count. In addition, as both the ballot complexity and the time needed to count go up, there is also a corresponding increase in the rate of human error. Mr. Mayran has already identified the challenges of the hand count experience in Australia and speaks to the need for timely results. The link between timely results and voter confidence is well documented, so I won't comment it further. Instead, I will just address how technology has solved this issue elsewhere. In the Philippines, implementing the same type of tabulating technology that is in wide use across Canada, the time to result went from weeks to hours. What makes this relevant to this committee is the fact that their ballot was perhaps among the most complex ever. The ballot featured over 100 voter selections in a multi-column, single-spaced, double-sided, 22-inch paper ballot. In terms of sheer size, 82,500 polls with 50 million eligible voters. In the case of Mongolia, where there is simply no telecom in over 30% of the locations, the time to result with this technology fell to 90 minutes for half of the polls, with over 85% reporting within a few hours. When this technology has been used in Canada with our local infrastructure, the results have been even better. In each case, the paper ballots were digitally scanned in real time, and the results from each location were modemed in after the election immediately following the close, populating a central database. Results from each poll were printed off as soon as the polls closed, and the consolidation was able to happen centrally in an automated fashion. In the case where an election may have successive rounds of voting, such as a ranked choice system, a proportional representation system, or a hybrid system, the database would already have all the selections, so each successive round would be instant and could be done with the press of the button. The next issue that arises is voter concern regarding the displacement of hand-counted paper ballots. This is not a new concern and has been addressed in thousands of jurisdictions with the advent of fully transparent auditing capabilities. Any modern paper-based tabulation system that has been deployed around the world now captures the image of every ballot and combines that image with the machine's interpretation of all the marks made by the elector. The resulting audit marks offer a completely objective and fact-based view to any auditor post-election of how each mark was interpreted and, more importantly, why. When used effectively, this process effectively mirrors the current practice of scrutineers standing over the shoulders of the manual ballot hand counters. There are many specific examples of recounts using modern tabulation technology, too many to list, where all recounts are exactly the same each time, a feat that is rare in a manual hand election and virtually impossible in a manual hand count election featuring a complex ballot. The key here is that the jurisdictions who have thoughtfully preserved the role of the scrutineer/independent auditor have found that the deployment of tabulation has increased the accuracy and transparency of the count. In addition to addressing the need of timely results, as Mr. Moran has brought up, and the accuracy and transparency issues that follow, tabulation technology also affords the built-in options to address other issues that exist in our current system that may be of interest to this committee. In no particular order, every jurisdiction that has implemented a modern tabulation system has concluded that the numbers of unintentionally rejected ballots can be reduced to zero when the administrator configures the system to warn electors of any errors done while marking the ballot. That deploying the so-called second chance voting, issues of language and literacy-based mistakes are eliminated. That in jurisdictions where a DRO box is used, such as Canada, issues of a blank DRO box causing a ballot to be rejected fall to zero. That the deployment of tabulation technology has provided options to the increasing problem of election day staffing by eliminating the need to have several large hand count teams in larger urban polling centers. And lastly, that the ability to leverage the technology to enable various assistive options, making voting accessible and allowing voters of all physical abilities to exercise their right to vote privately and independently. The last point has, in many cases, been the underlying driver to the move of tabulation technology around the world, and indeed has been used across Canada in various capacities over the last 14 years. Moving to the cost of tabulation technology, I will point out that Mr. Essenza has used the word congruence as an option to leverage Canadian government spending. In many electoral centres around the world, including the United States, the same agency is tasked with running elections for various levels of government. While not entirely possible given current Canadian laws, I will point out that there is precedence among many jurisdictions where various separate agencies leverage the same technological investment. In this specific case, there isn't any reason that I'm aware of why current tabulation technology that is currently being used across this country can't be leveraged for federal use. Before I conclude, I would like to point out that while my comments have been around systems that preserve paper ballots, there are other options available. Multi-channel voting is the premise that the voter has a list of options to choose from when exercising their franchise. Various channels would include, but not be limited to, vote by mail, vote by telephone, vote by internet. Elections Canada and various provincial agencies currently use vote by mail, while various municipalities use a combination of the three, almost always in conjunction with the paper ballot. Voting by telephone and the internet have been ongoing for over 13 years in Canada. I have experienced providing technology for all three methods, in addition to paper-based technology, and have been doing so since 2003. I note that Mr. Kingsley to this committee stated, online voting is coming fast. That light at the end of the tunnel is a train. To which Mr. Essenza added, the challenge is not the lack of technology, but the questions concerning privacy, security, and reliability of these technologies. And lastly, Mr. Moran added to this, caution is needed in moving forward to ensure that Canadians continue to have the same level of trust in the integrity of their elections. From my experience and through the conversations that I have almost on a daily basis with administrators across this country, I believe all three of those statements to be absolutely true. While each so-called channel of voting has its own pros and cons, I will limit my comment to what I know to be fact, which is, despite what this committee or what this country decides on which channel or combination of channels of voting is appropriate for our electoral norms, the challenges introduced with any of the various voting alternatives that this committee is considering can be met through the use of technology that is already being deployed in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alors, je prévois une très bonne discussion en fonction des témoignages.
I feel we're going to have an excellent discussion in light of the testimony we have just heard. So we will begin the 7-minute round for each MP with Mr. De Courcy. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our colleagues. And thank you to our witnesses for your testimony this evening. Feel free to express yourself in English, as I will. I'll begin with you, Mr. Hughes.
English, yeah. my first language as well. I wonder if you can speak to your experience watching voter turnout decline in New Zealand after the initial bump, the slight bump in voter turnout in the first MMP election. It's an issue that we've seen is taking place across Western democracies, and I wonder if you can provide some insight onto why that is happening in New Zealand.
I think it's a central challenge for all democracies that fewer and fewer voters are showing up. I think that you're right. The initial election, there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of information about a new system, and there were many voters casting a vote for the first time in their lives that actually counted for something. So there was quite a lot of excitement about that. I think that in my observation, in two of the elections where turnout was low, it would be twofold. One, I think it would have been lower under first past the post if we'd kept on seeing the same results that had been there previously. But also in both the elections where it was lower, it was a first-term government going for its re-election, and they were both reasonably popular governments, and so there was an expectation that they were going to win the election. It was not the second party was substantially behind, up to 20% behind in the polls from the first party, and so I guess that motivation wasn't quite as strong. Whereas in closer elections where there was only a 2% gap between the two bigger parties, there was a higher turnout.
Right, so it would be fair to say then that voter turnout is often driven by a lot of issues of political calculation, the relevant policy matters of the day, whatever the political culture dictates. I mean, I'm looking at voter turnout throughout the history of New Zealand, and I'm seeing back in the early and mid 80s, it was up over 90%, and of course we've experienced a decline here despite a relatively sizable bounce in voter turnout in this last election, I think driven by a desire for a new direction with the government. I wonder, I mean, is it fair to say that there are a whole range of ideas upon which voter turnout is driven?
I think the notion that just one thing would control voter turnout it would not be correct. I mean, there's many factors, but I think that in some of those 1980s results there was tremendous anger that I spoke of earlier. So big motivation to vote if you're angry about the way things are going. I think in some elections, if the result looks like a foregone conclusion, you may not be as motivated under might not feel as though it's crucial that you get there because the direction that you support is likely to get across the line. I think that though the one thing that would depress voter turnout consistently would be if there was a long tradition of votes not counting for lots of people. So that if you were a centre-right supporter living in a very strongly centre-left constituency, then there's just no strong motivation to vote other than out of civic duty. But I think that in a lot of democracies, regardless of what electoral system they're using, there has been this lowering as time has gone on. But in my opinion, though, PR can be one of the factors that can assist in that decline going even deeper. If all political parties are able to genuinely say to voters, doesn't matter who you vote for, your vote will count. And I think that's a fairly fundamental and decent thing to be able to promote to voters.
Thank you, Ms. Goss. I wonder, I mean, I listen and despite an admission that a well-run referendum can yield or can be a valuable educational experience for a population, I sensed an overall aversion to going down the road of referendum invalidating a new electoral system. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. But I wonder if you can explain your view or your experience with the multitude of different electoral reforms and modernizations that have gone on within the UK and Scotland in particular over the last number of years, and the importance of properly educating and validating those reforms with citizens as they were being implemented or before they were being implemented or post-implementation.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as I suggested, we've ended up in quite a British fashion with sort of incremental and piecemeal changes, which has given us a kind of laboratory of different electoral systems, and they'd have different origins as well. So we've had brand new institutions. We've had a lot of devolution of power from Westminster, and we've had these brand new institutions in Scotland and Wales, and with those came new non-first-past-the-post electoral systems. So I suppose looking at those examples, it wasn't necessarily, citizens perhaps had some sort of a role in validating the idea of a new devolved institution, and there were referendums around those, but not always particularly on the electoral system. So the origins have really been quite diverse. I've spoken, I think, a little bit about the 2011 AV referendum. There have been quite a lot of examples where a new system has really been kind of imposed, or political leaders have decided that this would be part of an institution and that's what they were going to do, and that's been quite a common pattern as well. I think one of the lessons I really took from, and I should say on referendums actually, and we set it out thoughtfully in our report, that we don't take a position as to whether in and of themselves they're good or bad. For us, it's all about the context and the timing and how they are conducted and how they're done, and how much emphasis is put on public information, public education, and a public role. And we make 9 recommendations about good conduct of referendums with a lot of emphasis on the public role, starting even when the legislation for a referendum is being put through, having a strong citizen role there. So it's been, there's been quite a variety of impetus and sort of motivation behind that, and therefore the public role has really varied as well. The thing that really stuck out for me about the electoral reform referendum was how very low the prior knowledge of the public was, and how there was no real sort of educative opportunities to become educated about the status quo, about first past the post. And if people don't understand what the status quo is, it's quite hard to have a rich conversation about what to replace it with.
Go to Mr. Reid now. Thank you, Mr. De Courcy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to start by saying I had a delightful meeting about 2-3 weeks ago, maybe it was a month now, with Darren Hughes in my office. We meant to meet for half an hour and stayed for 2 hours. It was really, really informative. Darren, don't take this the wrong way if I address all my questions to Professor Becker instead. Professor, I want to ask you a series of questions because you, well, for one thing, you run a number of models, and I want to explore a bit of them, but I want to start by dealing with something you raised in your written submissions to this committee, but which you did not raise in your presentation this evening, and that is the metric that you use to judge whether or not a system is proportional, and that's the Gallagher Index. Could you just chat with us a bit about what the Gallagher Index is and how you apply it to your models?
Sure. So in the graphs that we looked at earlier, there's always a gap between the percentage of votes and the percentage of MPs. And what the Gallagher Index does is takes all of those gaps and expresses them as a single number. Rather than saying, well, the Liberals are overrepresented by 15% and the Conservatives are underrepresented by 7% or whatever, it takes those numbers and puts them into a single number. And we can talk about how it does that if you want, but that's the intent. One of the downfalls of the Gallagher Index is that overrepresentation in, say, Alberta can be offset by overrepresentation in, say, the Maritimes. And that does not show up in the classic Gallagher Index. So I adapted it to what I call the composite Gallagher Index. I calculate the Gallagher Index for each region of the country and then average them together so that disproportionalities in the Maritimes and disproportionalities in Alberta both contribute to an overall picture of how proportional the system is.
So, first of all, to be clear, if we go to your written material, the material that was submitted to us, in that we would find the composite Gallagher Index being used, not the original Gallagher Index. Is that correct?
I use both. I present both of them.
Okay, all right. And just so I make sure I'm crystal clear on this, it was the case when the first Prime Minister Trudeau was in office, you would have situations where he had 0 seats in Alberta and all but 1 of the seats in, or all but 2 of the seats in Quebec. Those would have canceled each other out and given the impression that the system was actually more equitable than since it was less equitable, but it appeared more equitable than it would have been if he'd merely had the disproportion either up or down in only one of those regions. Is that correct?
That's correct. The classic Gallagher Index does not account for those regional disparities. The composite one does.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that. I mentioned this for the benefit of colleagues. I mentioned this in part because I think if we are looking towards, if the committee is trying to design proportional alternatives to the status quo, then the composite Gallagher Index would be a good way of testing the various models that might be looked at. I assume it's the case, Professor, to return to you, that we could assert that when you're faced with multiple versions, say, of multi-member proportional or multiple versions of STV, that one could actually set as one's goal accomplishing the lowest Gallagher Index number that is compatible with the hard barriers we face, such as the fact that we have to have all our seats within single provinces. Would that be correct?
Yes, the composite Gallagher is an excellent measure of the disproportionality of a system, and the lower that number, the better. But I think it's also fair to say that, you know, once we get in the 2, 3, 4% range, at that point, I have a hard time making the claim that decreasing it even further needs to be our primary goal. I think once we've got it down in the 2, 3, 4% range, that then our goal can shift to, you know, which one is simpler, or which one preserves the connection between the MP and the local voter better.
So when you get down to those very low numbers, I gather pushing them down further may require heroic measures, such as doubling the size of the House of Commons or increasing riding sizes vastly larger than they are now in order to get another couple of % improvement. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. And those heroic measures, in my estimation, once we're already down to the 2 or 3%, just aren't worth it. There's others, the law of diminishing returns. There's more important stuff to pay attention to at that point.
Okay, so that's very helpful. I wanted now to turn to the models you've worked on. I had this conversation with you just a bit earlier. You provide numerous models that involve adding seats to the 338 we already have. For example, the most recent model you circulated to us, the AV Plus model, involves 32 list seats being added on. I have a concern that if we were to do that, if time were not an issue, this wouldn't be a problem. But time is an issue. We've got the 2019 deadline approaching us. And I'm worried that we would run into the issue of having to confirm with the courts the constitutionality of doing this because of the fact that Section 52 of the BNA Act 1867, or Constitution Act 1867, says the number of members of the House of Commons may from time to time be increased by the Parliament of Canada, provided the proportionate representation of the provinces prescribed by this Act is not thereby disturbed. You have to disturb it to some degree, and obviously the courts would say some degree is permissible, but not too much. Once we go into trying to sort that out before the courts, the 2019 deadline may be lost. So the question I have is, would it be possible for you to model some additional models that assume we start with the 338 MP cap we have now, but that try to be as close to the lowest possible number on the Gallagher Composite Index, with some, looking at STV, MMP, and also rural urban. Would it be possible to do that and come back, submit those back to us?
Very briefly, please, if you can.
Sure. I do have a day job, so I want to talk more with you about exactly what you're asking for, but I would be willing to make myself available to this committee for more modeling work.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Cullen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all our panelists here tonight. This is one very rich field that I want to get into, and so time is of an essence. Thank you for that most recent offer, Mr. Becker. basically, if I understand it, as I look through your graphs, that the steeper and more dramatic the curve is, the more misbehaving, the more distortion that's going on within the system. Is that
Not quite.
Not quite. What am I wrong about?
It's hard to tell on these monitors, but those lines come in colored pairs. There's 2 red ones, 2 green ones, 2 blue ones.
Yeah,
We
and
want
the more
those,
they separate.
and the more they separate, the more misbehaving the system is.
So first past the post is bad.
Yes.
Alternative vote, worse.
Yes.
Okay, that's helpful. So if we wanted to distort the results even more, if we wanted to have votes reflected even less, we would take the system we have now and throw it into an alternative vote system.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's good because that's not the intention of this committee nor its mandate. So our mandate, just for context, I'm sure you all read our mandate, but is to change. This is to offer to the government some ideas and then a model which we recommend for change to improve our system, to make it a better behaving system, a more accurate system. In that context for change, and I want to turn to you, Mr. Hughes, for a moment, is in the New Zealand experience, you're often held up. New Zealand, New Zealand, New Zealand. We hear a lot about you. And often people arguing the opposite thing use New Zealand as an example somehow to try to prove their point. The context for the change that New Zealand went through was rather special. A high level of voter discontentment, maybe a gaffe from a prime minister promising one thing that was not written as on the paper. And up until maybe this morning, the context we were operating under was also unique in Canada, that we had an elected government with a majority under first past the post, also committed to making a change of that system that got them elected, understanding it's the falseness, the false majority that was achieved, similar to the last government we had, which was 39%. Yet this morning we had the Prime Minister musing that maybe people are happier now, so the mood for change is less, and so maybe the commitment is less. That unique alignment of stars to get change through is important. I want to get to a point Ms. Ghosh made about how voters see things differently under a change, that there are no so-called what we would call safe seats, seats that have just so traditionally voted one way, they kind of get ignored by not just the party that has the seat, but the other parties who think they can't get the seat. Was there any cultural change that went on in New Zealand in the way that voters experienced not just the campaigning of parties, but then what happens on policy if those voters remained relevant because their votes would be cast and affect who would form the next government?
I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Because of the stage of the process you're at the moment, by definition, you're looking at structures and statistics and how it would all work and what it would all mean, and that's an important thing to do. But if you're looking at the New Zealand experience, looking back on it now, I would argue that just as we count votes differently, what's been more important is actually the political cultural change. That actually, for a political party to be successful, it needs to reach out across to the entire country and not just see voters according to the one determinant of geography. Geography is important, of course, but it's not the only thing. There are lots of other values, and that forces parties to really shake up the way they campaign and think.
So it's interesting, because one of the things that was decried by not just my party, but the now governing party of the last government was the notion of narrowcasting, that messages and policies increasingly became focused on only the Canadians, quote unquote, that mattered to them, ones that were likely to vote for them, knowing they only needed somewhere around 40% or less in order to achieve a majority government. And it distorted policies, because you could just simply ignore 60% or more of the country and what they happened, and discontentment rose. This seems to happen to governments in Canada, that they might start off, and you hear every election night victory speech. I was elected by these Canadians, but I will now govern on behalf of all Canadians. And it's a nice and important thing to say, but given over time, you watch this narrowing and narrowing and narrowing, because the calculations, you can't please everybody. You got to start to focus on people that matter, in places that matter. Does the promise of proportionality upend that somewhat natural and cynical outcome of first past the post?
Well, I think it does because the larger parties obviously want to try and maximise their vote so that they can form a government and have as much influence on that government as possible, which is an entirely rational thing to want to do. But it's also looking to make sure that its message and its appeal is broad enough so that parties that are outside of it are interested in working with it post-election. I think the other thing that you said really chimes with me, which is that it's so easy talking about a topic like this to be obsessed about what it would have meant for the last election and what it would mean for the coming election. And with all respect to everyone who's here, I can understand why, because you've recently been elected and you'll be running for re-election soon enough. But I think on a topic like this, really you're having to think about what system do we want to be robust for at least 100 years. And then if you decide that, you'd have to assume that if parties behave competently and with integrity and with the dollops of luck that I mentioned that politics requires, that you'd get a fair shake of being in government over that time. But I think if it's a narrow focus on what does it mean for us next time, or what would have happened last time, right, that's more of a fairly in the end a self-defeating way of looking at it.
And this is the interesting exercise of reform, because everybody involved in voting on that reform in the House of Commons has a self-interest in not reform. Because whether you actually got into government or opposition, it doesn't matter. The system that got us here was the system that we promised to reform. So maintaining that commitment, even though it may speak against the self-interest of the elected politicians, is an interesting moment. I wanted to get into, Ms. Ghosh, just in
briefly though, please, Mr. Coleman.
Yeah, diversity. We just came from the House of Commons where a bill that was commended by many witnesses here as helping women get nominated in Canada. We ranked 64th in the world, was defeated overwhelmingly by the two major parties. The notion of diversity under proportional systems, because you've seen different models in the UK, can you speak to any influence or change, because you have working models on the ground, some proportional, some winner-take-all, in terms of the diversity of the parliaments that get elected?
Yes, definitely. So first past the post, the evidence tells us very clearly is the world's worst system for achieving gender balance in politics. Every other system is better. The reason they're better, and we see this from the Scottish and Welsh parliaments, is that they enable parties to do the right thing, to put forward a more balanced group of representatives to the population. The Welsh Assembly was the first gender-balanced parliament in the world. Now, the electoral system, but as Darren was reflecting earlier, we should never say the electoral system is, the prime cause of anything or is a silver bullet. It's not, but it's an enabling factor. So that was one of the factors there that enabled the parties to do take the positive measures to make sure that it was a more diverse parliament.
Thank you. Okay, Monsieur Thériault.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will give you a moment to put on your earpieces. Welcome, and thank you for your testimony. I will follow up on what my colleague has just said. Ms. Ghosh, you indicated that in order to achieve gender parity, it would take a structural change. That is, a change in the electoral system. Its structure would have to be changed to allow for the same number of men and women being elected. In my view, the list approach, and this is why I voted against it, even though I'm not a member of the two major parties here, I think this is a more fundamental issue than a measure which might be coercive and might be using women in a first-past-the-post system. Because under such a system, political parties could allow women to run in losing ridings. And ultimately, we would have parity in theory, but not in practice, because there would not indeed be more women elected. So, if I understood you correctly, you prefer a structural change rather than measures which would presumably improve the participation of women in politics under the current system.
prefer is a society and a democracy where all of our parliaments and our political institutions weren't necessarily a carbon copy of our society, but they were a mirror, they were a better reflection of all the people and the rich diversity that is out there. I think I've understood you correctly. You were saying that I was sort of advocating a structural change as the way forward. I think what I'm saying is, I mean, frankly, and we see this at home in the UK, if, and it's a party-based system, if parties wanted to field equal numbers of women and men and achieve parity, they could do that in first past the post by making sure that women were in winnable seats. It's women being in winnable seats that is what gets you to the parity. But in terms of the structures, what I'm saying is that proportional systems are an enabler, and they make it easier for parties to do what they want to do, which is to end up with a balanced parliament. So that's how I would put it.
On se comprend bien dans un système uninominal.
In a first-past-the-post system, it's easier to get women to participate in politics, because if there are several political parties, it's clear that the number of winnable ridings would go down. But if we change the system towards a mixed member proportional one, which includes a list of MPs, well, under such a system, each political party can put parity on the lists, and through that structural change, parity can be achieved. Because it's easy to say, let's keep the current system, let's pass legislation which contain incentives or which contain requirements on the parties. But if women aren't put in winnable ridings, in our system, which has two main political parties, it doesn't help more women to get elected.
Point as to whether you're asking me if I'm arguing that basically a plus of proportional voting is that it helps parties to get more gender diversity, or whether you're arguing that under first past the post that's also possible. Which part are we looking at?
OK. Je sais pas si la traduction est bonne, mais c'est pas grave.
I don't know if the interpretation was good, but what I'm saying is that if we want gender parity, it's best to change the voting system. That's basically what I'm saying.
System, and a fantastic plus is that it will help us to get nearer to, and it's not just gender diversity, but it will help parties to do the right thing and to field a more diverse, balanced slate of candidates. Yes.
Vous avez parlé que
You also said that there was not much time left to hold a referendum. What is your reference point? When you say very little time, what do you mean? Are you referring to 2019, between now and the next election, and a referendum which could be held at the same time as the next election? Why do you believe that we could not involve the population voters in a process which could reach a decision in a referendum in time for the next election?
I've been informed, and I'm making that comment on the basis of what Elections Canada have said about the 2-year implementation period and preparation period that would be needed to bring about a changed system. So therefore, working back from that and looking at some of the evidence we've taken from recent referendums in the United Kingdom and reflecting elsewhere as well, it would seem impossible to be able to do all the important preparatory work and the groundwork, the public education and information that you need to be part of a good referendum, to do that in the time available.
OK, on s'entend que
So we can agree that the Chief Electoral Officer has said that he could not hold a separate referendum before 2019 because there would not be enough time. So now we are in 2016. If this committee agreed on a mixed proportional system, for instance, and if the committee consulted voters, if the committee explained the difference between first past the post and the new system, and if it called on the population to make a decision during the next election campaign as to whether they agreed with the change, do you believe that the 3 years left would be enough time for that?
A part of the sort of the platform commitment that voters would be voting at the election, or are you advocating, suggesting that there could be a referendum around that time of the election? So I suppose the response I would make to that is that the position we take is how do you get the best quality and most inclusive public consultation, and that for me is the question and the goal. A referendum can be part of that if it's well prepared and well conducted and well done, but it doesn't have to be. There's nothing magical, if you like, about a referendum. There's nothing magical about a change to the voting system which suggests that it's of such a grand constitutional order that there has to be a referendum to make that decision. So I suppose the question for me would be, what's going to give you the richest and most inclusive public consultation? Is it going to be some of the discussions that you've been having and a citizens' assembly? Is it going to be that without a referendum, that with a referendum? So that would be my response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my colleagues and I have just finished 19 place visits in 10 provinces and 3 territories. So I had thought, and you'll have to forgive me, I had thought our theme song was, I've been everywhere, man, but I now want to change it to Ain't Misbehavin', saving my votes for you. But anyway, I'm going to ask you some questions, Mr. Weber-Baker, forgive me. And I'm going to try to get also to Darren Hughes and try to get some questions to Dominion Voting Systems. But I'm going to start because your summary says, first past the post frequently misbehaves. And if I heard your evidence correctly, in the models you ran, it always misbehaves. Is that a fair statement based on the models you ran?
Yes.
Okay, so...
I was trying to be generous.
So it's a misbehaving system that has not ever reflected in your checking out our past elections the way Canadians actually voted.
Correct.
And the only thing worse than that is alternative vote.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm wondering, given, and I'm very grateful that you already answered the question that you to Mr. Reid, that you'd be prepared to continue to help us with modeling. Did you look, I don't think you did, but did you look at dual member proportional, which is another system that has been presented to us?
No, I have not looked at dual member proportional yet.
Okay. And did you made the point that the rural-urban proportional was similar to Mr. Kingsley's model. You didn't run is there any reason you didn't do a modeling of Mr. Kingsley's proposal?
I have done a modeling of Mr. Kingsley's proposal. I didn't show a graph because it shows it very, the graph makes it look very good. But if you look at the composite Gallagher index, which I did not have enough time to talk about, it shows that it's not as good as it could be.
In the terrible risk that you might not ever again have enough time to talk about the composite Gallagher index, would you give us another bit of time on that, knowing that I want to move along? Can you give us a sense of it?
Sure. Once again, the composite Gallagher index takes into account disproportionality between different regions of the country. And for Mr. Kingsley's proposal, in the simulations or the modeling that I did, it appeared to be very proportional, but in fact, regionally, it was disproportional. Okay,
thank you. So the composite Gallagher index revealed that, which is something that we should bear in mind when we're doing further analysis. Well, I'm moving to the only former member of Parliament who's lived a life similar to those of the rest of us around this table when you were member of Parliament New Zealand. You made the comment that the change in political culture occurred when you went to mixed member proportional in New Zealand, and that it shakes up the way politicians campaign. Now, one of our goals and one of our principles includes trying to find a system that might promote greater civility, social cohesion, inclusive. How did the political culture change from first past the post to mixed member proportional in New Zealand, and is this notion that we might have greater civility? That's one of my notions, but it's rather idealistic and not grounded in experience. Can you comment on that from a New Zealand perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a higher level of cooperation amongst parties at a parliamentary level, and that's a very good thing. So that some of the hyper-adversarial nature and also the secrecy, we're in power, we'll hold all the information, you can't get any, that has diminished significantly. I'm not going to say it's been eliminated. I mean, it doesn't. Pixie dust didn't fall from the sky or anything magic like that. But it certainly has improved this notion of parties being able to work together. The two major parties broke up a little bit. They became slightly smaller, and people on their right and left broke into new parties. So it kind of revealed the internal coalitions that all parties have to have under first past the post. I think that improves civility because people understand their positions much better. But I think the shake-up in the campaign it got rid of the idea that there were no-go zones in part of the country, so that if you were from one party, there was no point campaigning somewhere else, because even if you had no chance of winning that constituency or that riding, there would still be a significant proportion of citizens there who might give you their party vote, and so it made it worthwhile. So I think it's encouraged parties to think much more broadly about how they approach campaigning, and I think that's been a good thing. Hard for the parties. I was in a big party, so I like the idea that we'd win majorities, but until we could win a majority of the vote, I never felt we should get a majority of the seats. And that used to be an old-fashioned, that used to be a minority view. That's now a view that I think nearly every politician in New Zealand would hold.
So even, for instance, of the larger parties in New Zealand that used to profit from first past the post with sort of big swings, you'd win one time and then you'd be out for a while and then it'd be your turn again. The parties that used to experience that, are they now comfortable? Not generalizing, but do you have the experience that some of the more right-wing and far left-wing politicians are comfortable with this now?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think what's happened is that the politicians and the parties have just made it work. And so, as I was saying before, there's no serious party that says let's upend this and go back to first past the post. And recently was the 20th anniversary of the system coming in, and I was interested that a cabinet minister who's in the National Party, the Conservative Party, who's seen as being on the right of her party, was writing on the anniversary saying that she's now in favour of it because of two reasons: one, every vote counts, and secondly, because of the diversity impact. So now this view in favour of every vote counting and diversity is held right across the political spectrum, from the centre right across to the centre left.
So in a segue, before I go to our friends from Dominion Voting, did you find that it took longer to count ballots? I know it's longer sometimes to figure out how the government's coming together, but the ballot itself, did it become more complicated? Did voters have trouble figuring it out? Did it take longer to count?
It's a transition. So the first term was a little untidy, as we might say, as the transition took place. And there were arguments about how the ballot paper was structured, but these teething problems all get resolved. And I think the biggest thing from a political class point of view is that as candidates, MPs, campaign activists, etc., we're used to this as being part of our lives. We want to know the result on the night. We want to know who's up, who's down. And it's about part of the culture change is just calming down a bit and leaving a few days or maybe a couple of weeks just to see what the people have said, and then what can be put together in order to form a stable and a government that can go the full term.
I don't know if I have time for a question. I think I hit my 7 minutes before I ask one.
Just very brief.
Okay,
If we can be brief and to the point with a brief and to the point answer, we can do it.
It may open up a whole can of worms, but I wanted to ask Mr. Poulos, I hate to say it, but I think your voting systems were in the New Brunswick election in 2014, where
that's correct.
They had, and that was it was a scary moment for me because I was hoping David Coon was going to get elected, which he was, but there was an hour of staring at pundits with nothing to say. So how did quickly, how did that happen, and is it an ongoing problem?
Sure. So there's official results and non-official results. The ballots marked by voters, they go through the machine, they get digitally scanned. Print tapes at polls close at a certain time. 1 second after the polls close, the result tape is printed off and posted publicly. The results get modemed in this case, to Elections New Brunswick, and they were added together correctly, mind you, and through months of recounts in the judicial court, it was found that it was 100% correct. When the unofficial results were transferred from, and this was outside of the system, if you will. This is an IT issue, from the official database inside of Elections New Brunswick to the news media. They used a freeware FTP file protocol. So when the file was transferred, it was not doing a proper checksum, and it was truncated. So that was an example of when you treat unofficial results as official and proper care is not taken to transmit the results to the media. So in previous elections, this was, I think, their 4th time running the same system. So you leave it to the court, who said very clearly there wasn't not one vote change. But it shook voter confidence because of the way the results were transferred and handled outside of the official system to transmit unofficial results. And we see this in the United States, for example, where media does exit polls.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Romanado now, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses.
And given that it is Women's History Month and what we've heard tonight, I just, have to quote the famous quote, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." So you'll forgive my directness because sometimes I'm not well-behaved. That being said, my first question is to you, Mr. Poulos. You mentioned in terms of transmitting results that they're modemed in. Could you let me know what would be the impact for, I guess, polling stations in rural areas with broadband connectivity issues? Would this be an issue in terms of the counting of the ballots?
No, and this was the example that I mentioned in Mongolia, which is the absolute worst case in the globe, in my opinion, in terms of connectivity. There are 3 methods. One is modeming the results, and again, these are all unofficial results. The official results are the paper ballots. There are redundant copies of memory in the machines, and a copy of the results are modemed in to the central location if there's a connection. That can be either satellite, that can be over broadband telephone. In the cases where it doesn't work for whatever reason, and that happens, then they are telephoned in, just in the same way that we currently see in Canada. So the returning officers phone in the results, and they get entered into the computer, double-checked and double-called. Sometimes, and it does. We know this happens in Elections Canada, where there's a transcription error. That's why it's unofficial. And then, of course, the official is when you reconcile the ballots with all of the audit logs from the polling location, and that happens some point after the election.
Okay. We had heard from a professor in Vancouver, Professor Simons, about internet security in terms of online voting and so on. We've heard multiple cases where even in the elections down in our neighbors to the south, that there's been hacks and so on and so forth. So I think that we've heard that the security or there's no guarantee in terms of the security that this would be something to be difficult to sell to the Canadian public. What are your thoughts on internet security? I mean, I love the idea of using technology to increase efficiencies, but in terms of the security, it's one of the principles in our mandate that we cannot, people have to feel that there's legitimacy and there's security behind the privacies and or the security of the actual vote.
Sure, great question. So I'll keep it as objective as I can. And
I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask you if you could keep it very brief, because then I have a question for your colleagues.
In terms of, I'm assuming your comments are centered around online voting?
Yes.
Yeah. In online voting, obviously, perception is obviously very important, and it's linked back to the trust of the voters. In Canada, I'm not sure if the committee knows it or not, but we are exceedingly high in terms of the electors and the trust that they place in the elections, such that when there are mistakes and wrong candidates get elected and then we fix it in the recounts, no one seems to care because there's we just understand that was probably an honest mistake by people that were tired counting ballots. So perception is obviously something that you have to take in deep consideration with online voting. The hacks that you read about in the United States are in voter registration systems, there is no online voting in the United States. And in terms of concrete experience, the fact of the matter is all online elections in Canada have been fairly small, and to my experience, the systems that we have run, I can tell you that they have not been hacked. There has not been any attempts on hacking. So, you know, I'm not going to. I won't be subjective, if you will, but that's just objective.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is for Mrs. Ghosh. Thank you. So you mentioned that changing the electoral system would assist in getting more women elected. And we've heard multiple witnesses say multiple things in terms of, well, actually, it's not the electoral system that will get the woman elected, it's many other things. So I'm just going to premise my question with a comment. When someone applies for a job, usually they look at the job description, maybe where the location of where the job is, the conditions of employment, what kind of tasks they do, and see, do I want to apply for that job? Very rarely do they say, what's the interview process going to be? What kind of tests am I going to have to undertake? So I'm not quite convinced that the decision for women to pursue public office has anything to do with the electoral system. There's two things. First is seeking the nomination, and I understand you yourself have gone to run for office. So there's seeking the nomination, and then there's getting the elected. So two different things. The seeking of the nomination, I firmly believe it has everything to do with the actual job. Do I want to go and live in Ottawa? Do I want to transfer? Do I want to work the hours? Am I going to enjoy the tone? Am I going to like the personal attacks? So on and so forth. I don't think it's the actual electoral system. Perhaps once they get the nomination, that could be a different story. And I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Sure. I mean, there are actually so many different factors at play. It's kind of hard to answer this in a nutshell, but I think it is important to say, and some of the research that's taken place in the United Kingdom has looked at the obstacles that might disproportionately affect women, like finance, not having as much cash to run. So I think, and that actually does affect the number of women who put themselves forward for selection, it's very expensive in the UK, and then the election as well. So I just think we need to acknowledge that, really, that there's a number of factors there. Very big picture, taking a step back, it is still right to say, though, that first past the post, the electoral system itself is a block on women becoming elected. Certainly when we looked at the evidence recently in the United Kingdom, there were kind of seat blockers. So it was basically male MPs who had been in the safe seats, coming back to the safe seat culture, for a very, very, very long time. And where you just have that single winner, of course, you're much less likely for that to be freed up, and you've got the safe seat culture as well. So I do think, I completely acknowledge what you're saying. It's complex, isn't it? And we would never say it's just the electoral system. There are a lot of factors there, but it is still right to say that the electoral system is one factor which is making it hard for parties to put balanced groups of people in winnable seats.
So in that line, would you agree then that it will take multiple tactics or initiatives for us to address that? For instance, as you said, if we have, I don't want to say safe seats, but seats that have been held by members of Parliament for many, many years and so on, perhaps a term max limit would prevent that. Perhaps our current electoral laws help in terms of daycare expenses for women candidates or male candidates or so on. Perhaps a family-friendly parliament would assist in that regard. Perhaps the idea of traveling, in a plane 12 hours just to get to work would be an issue. So all of these things, I think we have to look at. It's not just going to be one factor that will impact whether or not a woman decides to seek office.
Thank you.
Do you agree?
Briefly, yes or no?
Yeah. Yes, I do, but the electoral system is key as well.
Okay, Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you, our witnesses, for joining us today. I want to start with some of my questions for the good folks from the Dominion voting system. I do have to admit that my home municipality does use your services for online voting for the last municipal election. I was on municipal council leading up to that election. I unfortunately was probably the only one on council who actually voted against going that direction, but you were administering that election, and my wife actually commented on how much she appreciated the online voting because she was able to vote at 3 in the morning while feeding her then 3-month-old daughter. So she does appreciate that. I'm actually not going to start with online voting, though. I'm going to talk a little bit about your experience in the New Brunswick election, and I appreciate your response to Ms. May to clarify some of those issues. There was another concern was raised about that election, and that was the concept of spoiled ballots. There was some concern. One of the profs from UBC who actually presented to this committee, Professor Mosgrop, suggested that there was some form of challenge with feeding the ballot into the voting machine, it making it beep, and some kind of a form of intimidation, I guess, for lack of a better word, with it beeping and poll clerks suggesting, did you actually mean to spoil your ballot? Would you mind commenting a bit on that, on your experience and what suggestions you would make on that concept?
So just a quick note, when a ballot goes through a paper ballot scanner, you have the ability, the election administrator has the ability to configure it however they wish. So the easiest, the no change, if you will, setting would be the complete analogy to our current federal process where the ballot is scanned and drops in the ballot, pure and simple, and whatever happens, happens. The concept of second chance voting is if you wish to take advantage of the capability of the machine to warn the voter somehow that they are about to make a mistake. And so there's some common ones out there. And we see them in Elections Canada all the time. There's good stats on how many ballots are spoiled. A common one would be, I'll mark an X for yourself, and then realize, oh, no, I meant to vote for somebody else, and I'll scratch you out and I'll put an X. Then you get into the whole question of voter intent. Well, with a voting machine, we can warn the voter. Another common one is circling your name. That's not an X. That's not putting a mark in, should that count or not. So how you configure the machine, what kind of message to display on the machine, what language, do you make an audible noise or not? That is completely up to the discretion of the election administrator, and there are several considerations such as if there's a beep, am I going to be embarrassed that I've made a mistake on my ballot? So there's a reality to this. If we wish to warn voters while maintaining privacy and secrecy, that is a question. That is a compromise that you have to look at. If the machine makes a beep and somebody sees that John McKinstry then went from the machine, took his ballot, asked for a new one, and then put it back, we know that he made a mistake. Well, is that intimidating? Well, you know. So these are questions that we won't comment on. We provide the tools and just say this. It's all within the realm of possible.
So a situation like that would have been consistent then across New Brunswick. That would have been a decision made by Elections New Brunswick across the board. It wouldn't be individual polling stations.
Correct. And so when you use automated technology to tabulate ballots, one of the advantages is that every mark across every location, regardless of who happens to be counting the ballots, are counted against the same thresholds, and those thresholds are defined by the electoral agency, in this case, Elections New Brunswick.
Now, I want to follow up. You use the example of the Philippines, for example. I believe 82,500 polls, give or take, with a 22-inch document for the ballot itself. I assume there was an audit process undertaken to compare the results. How extensive would that audit process have been? How many ballots, what percentage of ballots might have been compared? How would that be undertaken? If you walk us through that a little bit of how you would ensure the integrity of an example like that with such an extensive ballot.
Right. So the judicial recounts were limited to any district where there was a contention, but every 100% of the ballots and their audit mark were available to anybody that wished to look at them. So, for example, one party chose to look at them all. And they were able to filter results. So show me the ballots where one party got a valid vote and my party did not, for example. And you can use your own subjective interpretation because you're politically motivated, you lost or you won. You can use your own subjective interpretation to compare it against the objective interpretation of the system. And that the system doesn't really know candidates or parties or politics. It just knows it integrates the number of pixels against the voting marks.
Now, in examples where you've done online voting for a municipality, for example, over a number of elections, more than one election, have you noticed an uptick in voter turnout after the first online voting? So in the second example of using online voting, was there any change in voter turnout from your experience?
So I'll speak specifically to my experience and the systems that we've run firsthand. There has not been an appreciable increase. And from my own anecdote, I classify voters in 3 categories: those who always vote, no matter how bad the weather is and how boring the election is; those who will never vote, even if they got to cast a deciding ballot; and then the third group, who really swings depending on does this election matter? And we look at elections all over the world where there's a galvanizing issue, and sometimes it's as simple as the local community wants to spend $100,000 on electricity lighting up the football field, and that draws in unprecedented numbers. But what we do find, so the answer is no, and I know that there's studies out there that show that quote percentage increases. I would submit that the sample data is not very good. It's smaller municipalities. It hasn't been run very often, and certainly hasn't been run around the world very extensively. But one thing that we do know from our surveys, and this is really from our customer side, the administrators, that the first group I mentioned, likely your wife who always votes, she appreciated the convenience. And another one that we see very often as number 1 on that list is I get the choice to vote near my office because I just have a busy day and I can't get home to go to the local community center, or at the local hockey rink because my son is playing hockey. And the vote anywhere concept, where I can get my ballot and it goes back to my riding, that is at the top of the list in terms of voter satisfaction.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Aldag now, please.
Great, thank you, and thanks to our witnesses. Ms. Sorry, your last name pronunciation, Ghosh?
Ghosh, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Just when you've talked about a number of systems that have ended up within the electoral systems within the UK. Can you give us an idea of time frames and really where I'm going with the question? It's the question of how rapidly change can happen, and as opposed to thoughts on a more incremental approach. And I assume that this probably evolved over time, different systems, coming in, and if it's ever been looked at, would UK residents have been ready to throw it all out and bring in new systems all at once, or kind of the evolution of new systems? Can you make any comments on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think evolution is the word. So just to take an example of the adoption of the single transferable vote in Scotland, first set of elections in 2007. I was just looking at some information recently that showed there was an uptake between the, as time went on, the second and third use of the new electoral system in people casting more preferences. So going down and saying, okay, I will cast a second, third and a fourth preference. So that's just an example from the voter's perspective of the kind of evolution of a system. There's certainly no evidence of anybody wanting to change to first past the post back from any of the proportional or the preferential systems. So I think that the timescales that they've been interesting. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, it was quite some years ago now that we've had the sort of the new institutions. So in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, we had these new institutions of the Scottish and Welsh Parliament, and with that a new electoral system. And there's just been that gradual evolution since then. Again, to give a concrete example, there were some concerns raised about having 2 different kinds of members of Parliament, and Darren might have reflections on this from elsewhere, but a constituency MP and a list MP, and then that's really bedded down in Scotland and just isn't really an issue anymore, and you've maybe had people who've even had a go at doing each of the roles as well. So it's really been evolutionary, and as Darren sort of indicated, kind of citizens getting used to it, parties getting used to it. It does take a bit of time, and I would say in all of our systems that are fairly new, maybe a decade or 2 decades old, it's a continual process, and parties will still talk about how their they're adapting to campaigning, which is practically different under new systems. There's evidence from the US about the greater civility. I mean, you're having different kind of conversations, you're participating in different areas where perhaps your party wasn't active before. So it's those cultural changes that take a while and they carry on evolving. It's not a one-night wonder, if you like.
Okay, great, thank you. And Mr. Hughes, I'd like to get your thoughts. The comment was that nobody's decided to go back to first past the post. I'm wondering if you can comment in the New Zealand case, and perhaps related to the UK as well. At what point do these new systems become the norm? We often hear that one of the fears with a referendum is that people will vote for the status quo, and so in New Zealand, has PR actually become the status quo, and that people are now comfortable with it and would be afraid to go back to first past the post? And the second, well, maybe I'll leave you with that one to start with.
I think that's a very accurate description of what has happened. So, if there'd been a referendum at the end of the first Parliament of PR, I suspect it would have been thrown out because it was such an upheaval and so many things that happened in that single first term that was counterintuitive to what people thought would happen. So there were these new list MPs elected on a party list. Some of them swapped parties. There was a lot of bedding down as the first past the post culture and personnel really were transiting out of the system, and then new people were coming in who were part of the new political culture. But if you fast forward 15 years on from that, at the sixth attempt to have a general election under PR, I think by then, yes, you're right, it was the status quo, and that's why in the referendum that was held then, having then had 6 goes at it, it won by a bigger margin than it had done when it first came in. So I think it had become the status quo. And then more recently, as I was alluding to, as the 20th anniversary has taken place, there's been figures that people would have been probably quite surprised to have seen in favour of PR when it was first introduced, now saying, look, this is part of the landscape. And I think some of the suspicion at the beginning that, this will just favour one side of politics, that hasn't been evidenced at all, that it's been very fair in the way it's treated all sides. And I don't think the country's ever ended up with a government that it didn't want.
Okay, and so along those lines, and again, both of you, if you'd care to comment, would you say that the citizens of New Zealand are really, do they see better policy? And I go to the UK example where there are these different systems. Are the policies that are coming out of the first past the post systems worse than the policies that you're getting out of the more proportional ones? Because we keep hearing that different forms of PR can solve all of our problems, and so the UK has these mixed ones. And so is there clear evidence that PR will give better policy? Or in New Zealand, was there a change from when you left first past the post and went into PR that you can say clearly, yes, this is way better policy now, the country's doing better on whatever those markers are?
I think there's 2 good examples of this. I think on the one hand, what's gone is the surprise policies coming out of nowhere, being enforced on the public, and no real parliamentary scrutiny because it's one large single-party majority government. So there's much more signalling by parties about what direction they're going to go before the election, and I think a lot more transparency, which has been a really good thing. And then the second example I'd give is that I think there's been more policy stability because you don't get the wild swings that first past the post gives you, the instability of a result one way, then the following election the opposite, winner takes all mentality, throw out what the last people were doing, unveil your own surprise ideas. What it means is that parties that were working with one government in one particular term might work with another government in the next term of a different political persuasion, but they have buy-in to some of those policies that were there. And I think that when there's been a change of government in New Zealand, what we haven't seen has been an upending of everything and then blank piece of paper back to the beginning. There's been quite a strong public policy evolution, and I would argue that's been a real strength for New Zealand's social and economic policy.
I'm going to get cut off. See if you have a minute to make a quick comment.
Very briefly, please.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just going to say that's broadly been borne out. Whether something's a good policy or not is going to depend on your perspective, but I'd really endorse this point about systems that enable and prompt parties to work together and do that detailed negotiation around policies are probably certainly going to have different policy outcomes.
Merci. Monsieur Boulris.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I promise that I will make an effort not to speak as loudly as I did during question period. Mr. Becker, I would like to start with you. I believe that what you showed us was quite outstanding and irrefutable. It shows the advantages of proportional versus first past the post. But what I'd like to say is this. We've often heard that a proportional system could create political instability. But in the facts, that's not necessarily the case. That system is not necessarily more unstable than first past the post systems. There have been more elections. There have not been more elections in Canada. There have been more elections in Canada than countries with mixed proportional systems. I would like you to tell us a little more, perhaps not during 7 minutes, but tell us more on your conclusions on the instability of public policy under the first past the post system.
So I'm not sure that that my simulations really have much to say about the instability of public policy. That's not something that I've attempted to model. I'm not sure that that's something I can model.
Vous aviez eu des propositions dans votre présentation.
In your presentation, I thought you had spoken to that, but now I'll move on to Mr. Hughes. And in the interest of transparency, I would like to say that several of these statistics and examples I gave over the last few months came from the fantastic reports that you have produced and that you had that you were kind enough to bring to me in Montreal. Now, you're a great witness for this committee because not only were you a witness to the change of a voter system, but you were also an elected representative in New Zealand at the local level, and you were also elected as a list candidate. Can you tell us the difference between those two things, these two different categories of representation for your constituents?
Huge interest when the system first started because people were obviously used to having single-member constituency MPs only, and then suddenly all these list MPs arrived, and there was, I think, in the early days, quite a strong feeling of Class A, Class B that did exist, and as Katie cited in Scotland, as a similar thing at the beginning. But then what I would observe is that as time went on, voters and citizens tend to judge the politician by their performance, by their achievements, rather than what type of MP they are. Now, of course, not everyone does that. There are always some who will want to make the distinction. I guess the constituency MPs continue to do the work that they've always done, and that you're all very familiar with here. And then list MPs fall broadly into two areas. One are people who in all honesty, probably want to be constituency MPs, and so their parties might assign them to a certain area to work in, and they'll run services and be invited to things and so on and so forth in a way that gives representation for voters of that party in that particular constituency, remembering that the same voter has two votes. Under that, in that New Zealand context. But then the more interesting area, I think, about list MPs is that it enables a richer diversity of people to come to Parliament, people who represent communities that might be significant across a whole country, but very, very small in status in a particular geographical mapped off area of a constituency. So that's enabled the Parliament, which was called the House of Representatives, to look much more like a House of Representatives because of that. And then also within that category are people who are policy specialists in certain areas, people who are experts at something, for whom the parties say, look, we really need somebody with these sorts of skills. They might not be somebody who'd be elected at a geographic level. They might not be somebody whose great strength is in running surgeries for constituents in need, but they are people who have a lot to offer public policy from a certain area. And I think in that context, being able to get people from both walks of life was very useful.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Hughes. Madame Gauche.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hughes. Ms. Gauche, I'm very pleased that you are here this evening, and it was a pleasure to listen to you. I also like your name, especially in French. I would like you to explain a little more what happened in the UK when the new regional parliaments in Wales and Scotland chose their MPs through the MMP system. Why was that chosen by these two regional parliaments? Perhaps we can leave Northern Ireland aside now because they're in an exceptional situation.
The simple reason that there's all kinds of things written in the history books about how the politics behind the different systems that were that people came up with. So it was felt on the one hand that the government wanted a system for the Scottish Parliament that would mean that one party could never get a majority. Actually, what we've seen, which is a good thing, is that voters will ultimately decide who they want to cast their votes for. And that's why sometimes, under the same system, you will end up with different sorts of power sharing arrangements. It might be a minority or a coalition government or a majority government, as we've seen in Scotland with the Scottish National Party. So there are a lot of politics there, just to give you the sense of it. I think it's really interesting. When we look at countries around the world, it's no surprise in a way that mixed member proportional is often the system that's adopted. After all, it perhaps brings a balance or a compromise between some of the different elements that people care about, keeping but developing a constituency link, having a good degree of proportionality but not obsessing over the nth degree, as Professor Becker has said. So I think it's no coincidence that perhaps we were slightly reflecting a global trend in the United Kingdom of adopting the additional member system, which is basically MMP.
Merci. On passe maintenant à Monsieur Reyes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reyes. Good evening to all of you. My first question is for Mr. Becker. First of all, Mr. Cullen told me that you are a fantastic witness. You even provided us with a list of questions, so I will use that list. I will use that list to ask my first question, and I'll just change 2 words to that question. Question 4, which says that alternative vote seems to be a valid option for many Canadians. And what I would add is that it would also be valid for our Prime Minister, who would be the chief person interested. Why do you believe... I would like to know exactly what your views are on the alternative voting system.
Say that that list of questions was not meant to be distributed. That was for me to have in my hip pocket just in case everybody gave me a blank look. But nevertheless, since you have them, let me address it. I think that alternative vote makes a lot of sense at the individual riding level. Or let me say that I can appreciate why it would be attractive at the individual riding level. I think there are also some problems at the individual riding level, but I can understand why it seems attractive at that level. However, each individual riding, the decision is made independently of all the others. Same as first past the post. And it's when you aggregate all of those individual decisions that it breaks apart and becomes a disadvantage for Canada as a whole. I have sometimes compared it to the economic theory of the tragedy of the commons, where a village has a common pasture, and everybody grazes their cow on that common pasture, and it works out wonderfully as long as everybody obeys the rules. But then some bright soul says, but I can graze 2 cows on that pasture. They make a locally optimal decision just for themselves. It's like the individual riding saying, it's best for us to do alternative vote. But if everybody does that, the pasture gets overgrazed and everybody fails. If all the ridings use alternative vote, then the system as a whole becomes very disproportional and Canada as a whole suffers.
Merci beaucoup. Ma deuxième...
Thank you very much. My second question is for you again, Mr. Becker. We've heard all kinds of witnesses and we've spoken with our constituents in our ridings. Local representation comes up time and time again. Under a proportional system, most witnesses have said that the number of ridings would decrease, rather that there would be fewer local MPs and more list MPs. I believe that my colleague Mr. Reid touched on this issue in his question. If we decided to maintain 338 ridings across the country, in your view, how many list MPs should we have to at least have a better proportional representation without necessarily aiming for the best or most ideal result possible? Is there a way we could avoid adding 200 or 300 extra MPs while maintaining our current 338? Is there any way we can get these list MPs to come on board, and would Canadians support this approach?
A number of different models, some of which maintain 338 MPs, make the ridings a little bit bigger as needed to make room for those extra list MPs while still maintaining 338. I have also run simulations or models where we keep 338 ridings, for individual MPs and add on the top-up layer as well. I think the optimal system, from my perspective, that meets your criteria either way would be the rural-urban. That maintains very good proportionality while still having just a very modest layer of top-up MPs, as few as 50 about, which is significantly less than MMP for the same degree of proportionality.
Je vous posais la question parce que c'est quelque chose, je crois pas qu'on a...
I was asking you the question because I don't think we really discussed this. Every 10 years, the chief electoral officer increases the number of MPs because the population increases. So I think it might be an idea to increase the number of MPs, not as quickly, but increase more list MPs. And this could happen proportionately and progressively. Do you think this could be a good approach? So to take small steps to one day reach the number of MPs to reach the good proportional number?
An incremental approach. The question, I think, is can we trust those in power to actually follow through on the good intentions? Can we trust those in power to actually, add the new MPs to that top up or to the list? If we can indeed trust that, what you have suggested is a nice incremental way to move from our current system to a proportional system.
Monsieur Hughes, vous avez parlé?
Mr. Hughes, you talked about list MPs, and that made me think of something. What would happen to MPs? So the list MPs, not the riding MPs. What happens to the list MPs at the second election? their names have to be put back on the list by their parties if they want to remain MPs. Is that what would happen?
Parliament would, and the law requires parties to conduct democratic processes for the assembling of the list.
Que si ils sont réélus par la liste,
if they are re-elected as list MPs, they might end up in another region of Canada. Or rather, they might be assigned a completely different region. Is that correct?
A matter for that member of parliament and for their party where they were, and the size of the party where they were trying to use their resources around the country. I think that would be a matter for what the party thought was the best way to use its resources.
Okay, thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Fraser.
Yes.
Welcome to our committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here substituting in this evening. I want to start by thanking, of course, the witnesses for your excellent testimony and for answering our questions. But I also want to thank the committee and you, Chair, and all the members and staff for the great work you've been doing. I know we've been following it closely. Members that aren't on the committee, and we really appreciate the good work you're doing. It's really a privilege to be here this evening and get to ask a few questions in this important discussion. So I want to start with you, Mr. Becker. With regard to rural and urban proportional, which I understand you're advocating for or saying is the best of all the systems that you've looked at, I'm wondering if you can explain the legitimacy of a member directly accountable to its own constituency and riding, such as in the rural area as you're proposing, versus one that is elected amongst other members who doesn't necessarily have one single constituency who can say, that's my MP and I want to hold him accountable if he doesn't do what I think he should do. Can you explain how the different levels perhaps of accountability or legitimacy would be reconciled in Parliament?
So I think it's important at this point to draw analogies from what Mr. Hughes talked about with mixed member proportional, because it's very much the same, that there are MPs that have broader, the top-up MPs, as I've often referred to them, have broader responsibilities and than do MPs that were in the local ridings. And I think it would be very much like mixed member proportional. They can address broader issues, not just issues specific to their local place. For those MPs that are in multi-member ridings, come from densely populated areas, there we can look to the analogy of single transferable vote and other places where there are multiple members. And they would be, in a sense, each of them responsible to their whole larger riding, okay, in terms of policy. But for constituency work, they might very well carve it up and say, this part of the riding is your job and this part of the riding is your job.
And just kind of very similar to the first question, but how, I would imagine that in an urban riding where you've got multi-member, there could be hard-working MPs that are taking on the vast majority of the work, for example, and the one who's not working very hard or who's not necessarily representing the people or doing a good job kind of gets lumped in and isn't held accountable. Could you comment on the problem that may create in some MPs perhaps being better MPs and dragging along those who aren't performing very well?
I think the voters are smart enough to tell the difference. And I think that those freeloaders, if we can use that term, would pay the price in the next election. And, it could be that they can attract enough votes to still squeak by, but it also might be the case that they're turfed out in favor of somebody else.
Okay, thanks. I want to move now to Mr. Hughes, if I can. Wondering in the New Zealand model, when you brought in the mixed member proportional system, how that change affected political engagement, memberships in political parties, for example, fundraising. Did it have any impact or noticeable effect on the political parties themselves?
I'm afraid I don't have any information about the actual party membership of the existing parties. I suspect that they continue to to decrease as they had been, although other factors came in. One of the major parties decided to have an election for the leadership of the membership, so that did increase. I think probably where there were increases in membership would have been for smaller parties that otherwise, up until then, didn't have much of a realistic opportunity of being in Parliament, and suddenly people who supported those parties thought, look, it's worthwhile getting involved and joining up. So I suspect that smaller parties saw an increase in their membership as a result. On the fundraising, I guess equally the amount of money that people were making as donations was going to more parties because there was more realistic chance of them being in the House.
Okay, and also in New Zealand, it's quite geographically different than Canada. Obviously, there's a larger geography here. There's more regions. There's 10 provinces and 3 territories. Could you comment on the differences that you would see in a Canadian system that has to address regional issues, linguistic issues, versus what you experienced in New Zealand?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that's a summary of what the issues are. New Zealand is a single chamber. Is a unicameral parliament. There's no upper house. There are no states or provinces. There are 3 official languages, and Parliament must engage in those languages. Yes, I can understand that the vastness does present some challenges about how you put it together. But I'm sure that, given that the government has made this commitment about it being the first past the post election, I guess thought's been given to how you can honour that, but also replace it with a system that will be a vast improvement on what you've got at the moment.
Do you think there'd be, though, an incentive for political parties to perhaps focus on more targeted issues in certain areas of the country versus having broad national vision that would answer to all regional concerns at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think it just depends on the party's size. So what tends to happen with PR, whether it's single transferable vote or MMP, rather than trying to squeeze everybody into 2 parties and then hoping that the result kind of reflects what people are looking for, you do have many more political players, many more political parties that are in the system, and some of them will be very much more narrow in focus than, say, a larger party. So it may be that they have particular concerns that they're wanting to address, and they stick to those issues, whereas you'd expect the larger parties that are seeking to lead a government to have that broader vision that you talk about. But I think that there's much more choice in the system, and so therefore consumer choice becomes citizen choice, and that's reflected across the political landscape.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser, and thank you for those excellent questions. Well, thank you to our panel. Again, another great discussion, and we deepened our knowledge of the issue of electoral reform. We appreciate that, Mr. Hughes, Ms. Ghosh, that you came from so far. Mr. Becker, we appreciate that even though you have a day job, you devoted so much time to these models to illustrate how systems behave. And of course, Mr. Poulos and McKinstry, thank you for your real-life, concrete, knowledge of how electronic voting, online voting works. It informed our discussion a great deal. So thank you to the witnesses. Tomorrow, to the members of the committee, tomorrow we meet here at 8:45. I believe Mr. Cullen, so thank you. You're free to oh, so we're going to do that tomorrow? Yeah, okay. So that's it for the meeting tonight. Thank you very much to everyone.